The morning the search party came up the hill, Roger Locher did the only thing left to him. He stopped moving. He had pulled leaves and rotting vegetation over his body in a shallow fold of ground that gave him almost nothing in the way of cover, and he pressed himself flat against the earth of a country that wanted him dead, and he waited. Voices carried up the slope, and some of them belonged to children. The local cadre had emptied a nearby village and sent everyone who could walk out into the brush to find the American they knew was somewhere on that ground. Boys moved through the undergrowth a short distance from where he lay. A water buffalo grazed close enough that he could hear it pulling at the grass, and when a boy came to fetch the animal, the child passed within a few feet of him while he kept his face in the dirt and his breathing down to almost nothing. He stayed there the whole day, with a village at play wandering across the ground that hid him. They had brought everyone out except the village dogs. Years afterward, Locher said it plainly. If the dogs had come, the search would have ended a different way, and there would have been no record left for anyone to tell. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. For 22 days in the late spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese Army hunted one man through the hills northwest of Hanoi and could not lay hands on him. They knew roughly where he had come down. They knew he was alive. They had the ground, the numbers, and all the time in the world, and still he slipped through every net they put out. What follows is the true account of how a single American airman stayed uncaught for longer than anyone else in that war, on terrain crowded with the people searching for him. What the man in the front seat of his airplane gave up so that the secret behind it all stayed buried, and what it finally took to bring Roger Locher home. To understand why he was lying under that vegetation, you have to start with the war as it stood that spring. On the 30th of March, 1972, North Vietnam launched the offensive its commanders called the Nguyen Hue Campaign. The Americans named it the Easter Offensive because it opened on Good Friday, and it was an all-out attempt to break South Vietnam in a single season. By that point, most American ground troops had already gone home under President Nixon's policy of handing the fighting back to the South Vietnamese, so the heaviest American weight left in the theater was air power. In early May, Nixon authorized a renewed bombing campaign over the North called Operation Linebacker, and for the first time it included mining the main harbor at Haiphong. The goal was to strangle the flow of supplies feeding the northern armies in the south. That turned bridges into priority targets, and the most important of them all was the Paul Doumer Road and Rail Bridge in the heart of Hanoi. Linebacker also brought something new to the war, the first wide use of laser-guided bombs, which let a handful of aircraft hit a bridge that had survived years of conventional attacks. That bridge mattered out of all proportion to its steel. The Paul Doumer carried road and rail traffic across the Red River into Hanoi, and for years it had shrugged off nearly everything thrown at it, because hitting a narrow span from a fast-moving aircraft with unguided bombs was closer to luck than to skill. The new guided weapons changed the arithmetic. A small number of aircraft could now do what whole formations had failed to do before. The catch was that those aircraft had to survive long enough to release, which meant someone had to clear the MiGs off the board first. The offensive that triggered all of it was the largest the North had ever launched, a conventional invasion that came across the demilitarized zone and out of the mountains on 3 fronts at once, toward Quang Tri in the north, Con Tum in the Central Highlands, and in Loc above Saigon. South of Quang Tri, columns of fleeing civilians were shelled along a stretch of road the survivors would remember as the Road of Horror. With the American ground forces mostly gone home, the response fell to air and sea power. Aircraft from 6 American carriers worked the coast and the battlefields. Naval gunfire hammered the shore, and in May the Navy mined Haiphong Harbor to choke off the Soviet and Chinese ships that kept the North supplied. Linebacker was the part of the response aimed at the heart of the North itself. The problem was getting the bombers to the target. Hanoi sat under one of the densest air defense systems ever assembled, a layered wall of anti-aircraft guns, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG fighters scrambled from a ring of airfields. By the early 70s, the Air Force was paying a hard price in the air over the North, losing crews at a rate that worried the men running the war. Somebody had to clear a path for the strike aircraft, and keep the MiGs off their backs while they worked. That job belonged to the F-4 Phantom Crew's Flying Combat Air Patrol, and the best of them came from the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron, the unit the whole Air Force knew as the Triple Nickel, based at Udorn in Thailand under the 432nd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing. The defenses are worth picturing because they explain everything that came after. The approaches to Hanoi bristled with radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, large weapons the size of telephone poles that had been knocking American aircraft out of the sky since the middle of the 1960s, ringed by thousands of anti-aircraft guns and backed by MiGs scrambling from a string of airfields. Yen Bai, sitting up the Red River from the capital, was one of the busiest of those MiG bases. A man who came down in that country was not merely behind enemy lines. He was inside one of the densest concentrations of air defense on Earth, in a place where any helicopter sent to find him would have to fly through all of it twice, once going in and once coming out. The man most responsible for sharpening that edge was Major Robert Lodge. As chief of the Wing's Fighter Tactics Branch, Lodge had led a quiet overhaul of how American Phantoms fought the MiGs. He made repeated trips to 7th Air Force headquarters to plan how the strike flights would be protected, and early in 1972, he arranged to have 10 specially modified F-4DS transferred from South Korea to Udorn. Those aircraft carried a piece of equipment with the designation /APX-81, known by its code name, Combat Tree. The system was a closely held secret. It worked by electronically listening in on the very identification gear the North Vietnamese used to track their own MiG-21s, which let an American crew pick out enemy fighters far beyond the range at which a human eye could see them. For air crews who had spent years guessing, it was a transforming advantage, and Lodge sat at the center of it. He knew the tactics, the technical workings of the system, and the intelligence that fed it. By the spring of 1972, the air war over the North had become an expensive place to work. The Air Force was losing aircraft and the men inside them at a rate that gnawed at the people running the campaign, and the cause was the wall of guns and missiles and fighters that Hanoi could throw up on short notice. Combat Tree was the kind of edge that did not come along often. It did not make a Phantom faster or its missiles better. It simply let an American crew know where the enemy was before the enemy knew the same about them. And in a fight measured in seconds, that head start was the line between killing and being killed. The advantage lasted only as long as the secret held. If the North Vietnamese, or the Soviets and Chinese standing behind them, ever learned how the system worked, the trick could be beaten and the edge would be gone. That was the weight Lodge carried in his head every time he crossed the border, and it is why the decision he had already made about capture was not the bravado his friends took it for. It was a calculation made cold and kept. For a long stretch of the war, American crews had been getting the worst of the air-to-air fight. The exchange rate over the North had slid to something close to even, a humiliating figure for a force flying faster and better armed aircraft, and the cause lay in tactics and training that had gone stale while the enemy sharpened. Both services set out to fix it. The Navy stood up the fighter school that would be remembered as Top Gun. The Air Force leaned on men like Lodge and on the Combat Tree advantage. By the spring of 1972, the work was beginning to show, and the 10th of May would put the result on display in a single morning for better and for worse. That knowledge shaped a decision Lodge made long before the 10th of May. He understood that if he were ever shot down somewhere too deep to be reached, capture would put all of it at risk, and that under interrogation, he might give up the secrets that kept other American crews alive. So he resolved that if he went down in a place where rescue could not be attempted, he would not eject. He would ride the airplane into the ground rather than be taken. He said it out loud to the men of his wing, and according to later accounts, he said it to his family as well. His squadron mates heard him, and most of them filed it away as the kind of grim thing fighter pilots say. Steve Ritchie, who flew in the same flight and would later become the Air Force's only pilot ace of the war, put it simply afterward. Lodge always told them he would never be captured, Ritchie said, and none of them believed him. In the backseat of Lodge's Phantom sat Captain Roger Locher, his weapons systems officer. Locher was on his third combat tour in Southeast Asia and had flown well over 400 missions, and together the two of them ranked among the most successful MiG hunting teams in the theater, with 2 kills already to their credit before that May. Lodge was a demanding pilot who expected a great deal from the man behind him, and he had found in Locher someone who could keep up with the way his mind worked as a fight unfolded, feed him what he needed at the moment he needed it, and never fall behind the airplane. The two flew together almost to the exclusion of anyone else. That partnership was about to be tested past anything either man had trained for. Locher was a farm boy from Sabetha, in the northeast corner of Kansas. He had gone to Kansas State, joined the Air Force through its reserve officer program, and pinned on his commission in 1969, then trained as a navigator before he was sent to the back seat of the Phantom and on to the Triple Nickel at Eudorn. The partnership with Lodge had already left a mark on the record. On the 21st of February, 1972, the two of them scored the first American air-to-air victory in nearly 4 years, a night kill over the mountains of northeastern Laos, the kind of work that got a crew talked about. By the time Linebacker opened, they were widely regarded as the most experienced fighter crew in Southeast Asia, and the day they were about to be handed was the largest the air war had yet produced. Linebacker opened on the morning of the 10th of May, 1972. Counting the Navy aircraft flying off the carriers offshore, around 120 aircraft were committed against targets in North Vietnam that day, with roughly 88 of them set to cross into enemy airspace. The plan, as Ritchie later described it, was to send the combat tree Phantoms in low and fast ahead of the strike, intercept the MiGs that would rise to stop the bombers, and clear the way for the strike Phantoms to put their laser-guided bombs on the Paul de Mer Bridge. Oyster Flight, 4 F-4DS led by Lodge and Locher in Oyster One, came in below 300 feet and held radio silence, working their orbit roughly 25 to 30 miles west of Hanoi until the combat tree gear picked up what they were waiting for, a flight of 4 MiG-21s circling to the northwest of the city. Out over the water, the cruiser USS Chicago sat watching the skies for the whole force under the code name Red Crown, and it warned Oyster Flight that several formations of MiGs were airborne and that one group of 4 was turning toward them. The Phantoms dropped their external fuel tanks and pushed up to fighting speed. As the enemy came into range and was confirmed hostile, 3 of the Oyster Phantoms fired a total of 5 radar-guided Sparrow missiles head-on. 2 found their targets. One of those belonged to Lodge and Locher, their 3rd MiG, and in that instant the morning looked like a clean and total success. The combat tree gear had done exactly what Lodge built it to do, picking the MiGs out of the clutter and letting the Phantoms shoot first, head-on, before the enemy had sorted out where the threat was. Another of the kills that morning went to Steve Ritchie, the first of the 5 that would one day carry him to ace, brought down with a pair of Sparrows from several miles out. For a few seconds the sky belonged to Oyster Flight. Ritchie called it later a perfectly planned, perfectly executed mission that had produced 4 American victories. Then he added the rest of the sentence. It was too good to be true. Lodge and Locher were lining up a 4th kill, fixed so tightly on the MiG ahead of them that they never saw the danger coming from another quarter. A flight of MiG-19s, Chinese-built fighters the Americans also knew by the designation J-6, dropped on Oyster One from above and behind. This was not luck. The North Vietnamese had learned to fight in layers, sending the nimble MiG-21s up as bait while a second flight of MiG-19s, steered by ground controllers, slid in behind the American Phantoms the instant they committed to the chase. It was an old idea, borrowed from Soviet ace of the Second World War, and that morning it worked exactly as designed. The wingmen shouted warnings over the radio, but there was no time left to use them. 30mm cannon fire tore into the Phantom. At first the damage seemed survivable. Locher felt the aircraft begin to slow, felt a series of hard, sickening yaws to the right that pointed to a wrecked right engine, and the jet began to roll. Lodge fought it. Locher offered a few things to try. Lodge answered after a pause, and what he said closed off every option. They had no hydraulics. A Phantom can fly with many systems shot away. Hydraulics is not one of them. Once the last of the fluid bled out, the controls would lock and the airplane would fall out of the sky. As the fire climbed forward along the fuselage and the rear canopy began to brown with the heat, Locher told Lodge he thought he was going to have to get out. By the account Locher later gave his squadron mate Chuck to Bellevue, he said it was getting pretty hot back there and he might have to leave, and Lodge answered, "All right, why don't you?" There was nothing dramatic in it. Locher reached for the ejection handle as the Phantom hung inverted in a steep dive somewhere below 8,000 feet, and he pulled it at what de Bellevue called the last possible instant. The seat fired him clear, and he came back to himself hanging under his parachute over enemy country. He never saw a second shoot. Robert Lodge stayed with the airplane and rode it down, exactly as he had told them all he would, and he was killed when it crashed. The men who had not believed him watched the burning Phantom fall and understood, too late, that he had meant every word. What had begun as a triumph, Ritchie said, was ending in a tragedy. From the other Phantoms, the end of Oyster One was a thing glimpsed in pieces through the churn of a turning fight. A crew in the trailing Oyster Flight, high above at 20,000 feet, caught the burning aircraft in the corner of the sky and watched it fall like a meteor. The smoke was thick enough that no one saw a parachute. For all anyone in the air could tell, both men had ridden it down. The survivors of Oyster Flight, shaken by the sudden loss of their leader, broke off and sped out of the area, and the first great clash of the morning was over. What happened to Oyster One was one piece of the largest air-to-air battle of the entire war. The 10th of May, 1972 opened a day of running dogfights up and down the sky over the north, and by the time it closed, both the Air Force and the Navy had made history. Out over the coast, flying off the carrier Constellation, a Navy crew named Randy Cunningham and Willie Driscoll shot down 3 MiGs in a series of swirling fights, bringing their total to 5 and becoming the first American aces since the Korean War. Both men were graduates of the Navy's new fighter weapons school, the program later known as Top Gun, and the kills they scored that day would bring them a nomination for the Medal of Honor. Other Navy crews added more. Counts of the day vary, as they always do in a fight that size, but by most reckonings something like 11 enemy fighters went down against the loss of several Phantoms, and the morning marked the first time American crews tangled with the Chinese-built J-6, the very type that had just killed Lodge. Out of that day grew one of the war's most durable legends, the story of a North Vietnamese ace the Americans called Colonel Toon, or Toom, supposedly the deadliest enemy pilot of the war, credited in barracks talk with more than a dozen kills, and supposedly shot down in the great dogfight that afternoon. The record does not hold the legend up. Historians who went looking for Toon never found a North Vietnamese pilot by that name, and the enemy ace most often tied to the story flew a different aircraft and was not lost that day. The most careful reading is that Toon was less a man than a composite, a single-name American cruise hung on an enemy who seemed too good to belong to one person. It is a useful reminder. Even on a day this thoroughly recorded, the war grew its own myths within hours, and the honest task is to keep the part that can be checked apart from the part that cannot. The aces and the legends belong to the men who flew home that evening. One man from Oyster Flight did not. So the secret of Combat Tree went into the ground with the man who guarded it, and the man who survived came down alone, 40 to 75 miles from Hanoi, depending on which account you read, in hilly country near the airfield at Yen Bai, one of the busiest MiG bases in the north. By the brutal arithmetic of air rescue, he was already as good as lost. Air Force studies running back to the Korean War had found that a downed airman's chances were good only if help could reach him inside the first 15 minutes, dropped sharply after half an hour, and fell below 20% once he had been on the ground more than 4 hours. By the time Locher settled in for his first night, he had been down for 11 hours, deep inside a region thick with troops, farther in than any American would be when the question of going after him finally arose. Locher made 2 decisions in those first hours that kept him breathing. The first was to stay off his radio. The moment he keyed it, the enemy would know an American had lived and roughly where to find him. So he left it silent and used it only to listen. The second was to walk west. The mountains in that direction were more thinly settled, and if he could cross the wide, cultivated valley of the Red River and reach the wooded high ground beyond, his odds of being pulled out would climb. The catch was the distance. By his own reckoning, he had something like 90 miles to cover. He decided he would live off whatever the country gave him and try to make about 2 miles a day, moving at first light with the sun at his back and again at dusk into the setting sun, and lying hidden through the dangerous middle of every day. The plan was almost absurd on its face. 90 miles, on foot, at 2 miles a day, through the most heavily patrolled country in the north, on whatever a man could find to eat in a spring forest. That arithmetic alone meant 6 weeks or more of walking and hiding, and the recovery studies said his real chances had run out within hours of his landing. Locher understood the numbers as well as anyone alive. He set them aside and started walking, because the only other choice was to sit still and wait to be found, and being found here meant a cell in Hanoi if he was lucky. The discipline that took is easy to underrate. Over those weeks, American aircraft crossed the sky above him more than once, the sound of friendly engines carrying down through the canopy. And every time, the simplest human impulse was to grab the radio and call. Locher did not. He knew that one transmission caught by the wrong ear would steer the whole search straight to him, and that the only rescue worth anything was one launched when he had reached ground helicopter could actually approach. So he listened and stayed quiet and kept the radio dark day after day while the easy way out sat in his hand. The legend of escape and evasion is a story of motion. Is the clever man outrunning his hunters, using the land, turning the tables? What Locher actually did ran the other way. Survival for him came down to stillness, to a patience that bordered on the inhuman, and to luck he had no hand in. The morning after his first night, he had gone barely a couple of 100 yards before the sound of search party drove him under that patch of rotting vegetation. And there he stayed while the village and its children worked the slope around him and the water buffalo grazed close enough to touch. He later said that some of the little ones came within 30 feet of where he lay. They were more interested in the chance to skip their chores than in finding anything, and they never looked hard enough. When the searchers finally drifted off, he switched on his radio and listened, and what came through gave him no comfort. A rescue attempt for some other man, somewhere to the south, was ending in failure. His second full day went much the same. A few 100 yards of movement, then another search party, then long hours pressed into the dirt. On the fourth day, the hunt around him was called off, and only then did the slow grind of his journey settle into a rhythm. He grew weaker as the days stacked up. Food was the hardest part. It was spring, and there was little wild fruit or edible shoot to be found, so he ate what scraps the forest offered and walked on close to nothing. The one thing the country gave him freely was water, because the hills ran with streams. The same terrain that hid him also wore him down, the steep slopes and tangled undergrowth dragging at a body that was steadily failing. Over the course of the whole ordeal, he lost about 30 pounds. There were close calls he would carry for the rest of his life. The day his search came within a few feet of him, the children, the buffalo, the moment he was sure it was over and somehow was not. Brush by brush, ridge by ridge, he kept moving toward the setting sun. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It is worth sitting with what that meant in plain terms. The studies the Air Force kept on rescue were not encouraging reading for a man in his position. They held that the odds of recovery were strong only in the first minutes after a man came down, that they fell off sharply within the hour, and that after 4 hours on the ground deep in enemy country, they dropped into the low percentages and kept falling. Locher was not counting his time in minutes or hours. He was counting it in weeks. Every additional day he stayed free was a day the numbers said should not have happened, and he bought each one the same way, by being somewhere the searchers were not, by making no sound, and by trusting the hills and the dusk, and the plain fact that a man lying still under a layer of leaves is very hard to see. By the end of May, he had covered roughly 12 miles and reached the edge of the forested high ground. In front of him lay the flat, open, heavily worked floor of the Red River Valley, and beyond it the wooded hills he was aiming for. He found a place to sleep. When he woke on the 1st of June, he discovered he had slept far past the hour he meant to, late enough that crossing the open valley in daylight was impossible, and he would have to spend the whole day where he was. He took a heart at first. Then an anti-aircraft missile lifted off from the direction of the Yanbai airfield and climbed into the sky, and his disappointment turned into something close to hope. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.